It started with a long, empty stretch of highway, the kind where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional glow of a star. The Arizona desert seemed endless that night. It was late. Too late for anyone else to be on the road. And the silence outside was only broken by the hum of my engine and the soft rustle of wind. Then, without warning, my car jolted. The dashboard lights flickered before fading completely, and the engine sputtered into silence. I coasted to the side of the road, gripping the wheel tight. I sat there for a moment, staring out into the pitch-black void. My phone had no signal. Of course. Typical. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and stepped outside. The air was cool, dry, and unnervingly still. The only sound now was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots as I popped the hood. I stared at the engine, not really knowing what I was looking for. That's when I saw it. A faint glow in the distance. It wasn't there before. Squinting, I could just make out the shape of a small building. A gas station, maybe? Relief flooded through me. I grabbed my keys, locked the car, and started walking toward it. The closer I got, the stranger it looked. The station's lights flickered erratically, casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked asphalt. The sign above it was missing letters, leaving behind a garbled mess of words. A single gas pump stood at the edge of the lot, rusted and leaning slightly to one side. The glass door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint smell of something burnt. Rows of dusty shelves were lined with faded candy bars and cans of soda that looked decades old. A small counter stood in the corner, and behind it I saw him. He was tall and thin, his face pale and expressionless. He wore a uniform that looked decades out of style, the kind you'd see in old photos of service stations. His hat was tilted slightly, casting a shadow over his eyes. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should say anything. Finally, I forced out a greeting. "Hey, my car broke down a few miles back. Do you have a phone I could use?" He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. He just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made me want to turn around and leave. But I needed help. "Hello? Can you hear me?" I stepped closer, but his eyes didn't follow. It was like he was looking through me. Then I heard it. A faint sound like shuffling footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the station. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight toward the back of the store. Nothing. Just rows of empty shelves. When I turned back to the counter, he was gone. My heart started pounding. I looked around the store, shining my flashlight into every corner. There was no back door, no place he could have gone. But he wasn't there. The shuffling sound grew louder. It was coming from behind me now, closer this time. I spun around again, and that's when I saw it. A figure, just outside the window, standing perfectly still beneath the flickering light of the gas pump. It wasn't him. This figure was smaller, hunched over, its outline blurred in the dim light. It stood there for what felt like an eternity before stepping back into the shadows, vanishing completely. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. I bolted for the door, my heart racing as I stumbled back onto the lot. The gas station lights flickered more violently now, casting strange patterns on the ground. As I approached the pump, I heard it again, the shuffling, now accompanied by faint whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from every direction. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. That's when I felt it, a presence. Someone or something was behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, closing in. Somehow I found the strength to move. I ran. I didn't care where as long as it was away from that gas station. My car was up ahead, barely visible in the dark. When I reached it, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I climbed in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My fingers found the ignition, and to my surprise, the car started immediately. I glanced back toward the gas station. The lights were still flickering, but now the entire building seemed to shimmer like heat waves on asphalt. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No fading, no collapse, just nothing. I didn't stick around to question it. I floored the gas pedal and sped down the highway, not daring to look back. Hours later, when the sun finally rose, I pulled into a small town and found a mechanic. When I told him where I had broken down, he gave me a strange look. "That stretch of road," he said. "There hasn't been a gas station there for decades. Burned down in the 70s. They say the owner still haunts it, though. Looking for customers he never got to help." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked away, the memory of that night still fresh in my mind. I haven't taken that highway since. The forest always felt like home to me. There's something calming about the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the soft crunch of dirt beneath your boots. But on this trip, something felt different. I was hiking solo through a dense stretch of woods. The trail was narrow, barely a trail at all, really. I liked it that way, off the beaten path, away from the crowds. That's where I found my peace. By mid-afternoon, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches almost blotting out the sunlight. The air grew heavy, and the forest, usually alive with sound, became eerily quiet. No birds, no crickets, no wind brushing through the leaves. Just silence. That's when I stumbled onto it, a clearing, perfectly circular, like someone had drawn it with a compass. The grass inside was shorter than the surrounding forest, almost unnaturally neat, and there were strange markings etched into the dirt. I stepped closer, my curiosity stronger than my caution. The marks weren't random. They had a pattern to them. Symbols, maybe? Some looked like stars, others like jagged lines crisscrossing each other. I crouched down to trace one with my finger when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I froze, my eyes darting around the clearing, but there was no movement, no sound, just that suffocating silence. Something about the place felt wrong. I decided not to stay long. I snapped a few pictures with my phone and backed out the way I came, keeping my steps light, my breath shallow. By the time I found a decent spot to set up camp, the sun was sinking behind the trees. Shadows stretched long and dark across the ground. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and tried to shake off the unease. Night fell quickly. The silence from earlier followed me, settling around the campsite like a heavy blanket. I told myself it was just a quiet patch of woods, nothing unusual. But then the whispers started. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, coming from all directions. I strained to make out the words, but they weren't in any language I recognized. It sounded like a conversation, a soft, hurried exchange between multiple voices. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the light only seemed to deepen the darkness. My fire crackled behind me, a small comfort in an increasingly unnerving night. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the distance, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. They didn't blink or move, just hovered there, watching. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for something, anything to defend myself. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, almost frantic now. I shouted into the darkness, hoping to scare whatever it was away. The eyes disappeared instantly, and the forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, gripping a pocket knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, the relief was overwhelming. The forest looked so ordinary in the daylight, almost like nothing had happened. But as I packed up my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were scratches on the fabric, long and deep, like claws had raked across it. And there were handprints, too small to be an adult's, pressed into the dirt around my campsite. I didn't bother packing neatly. I shoved everything into my bag and left, walking faster than I ever had in my life. I never found that clearing again, despite trying to retrace my steps. It's as if it never existed. But those pictures on my phone, the ones of the symbols in the dirt, they were gone. It was a cold, restless night on the coast, the kind where the wind howled through cracks in the rocks and the waves crashed like they were trying to escape the sea. I'd heard the stories. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the old lighthouse that stood forgotten on the edge of the cliffs. They claimed that even though it had been abandoned for decades, people still saw its light flicker to life on stormy nights. I'd been camping nearby, and curiosity got the better of me. With my flashlight in hand and the moon barely breaking through the clouds, I decided to see it for myself. The path to the lighthouse was treacherous, overgrown with sharp coastal shrubs and littered with jagged stones. Every step seemed louder than the last, the crunch of gravel underfoot swallowed by the roar of the wind. When the towering silhouette of the lighthouse finally came into view, I stopped in my tracks. It loomed above me, weathered by time and salt, its paint peeling in long streaks. The windows were dark, cracked, and lifeless, but there was a strange energy about the place. It felt as though the lighthouse was aware of my presence. I hesitated at the rusted door, the faint smell of the ocean mixing with something metallic and old. With a deep breath, I pushed it open, the hinges screeching loud enough to make me wince. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the faint sound of something distant, like a low hum. The ground floor was littered with debris, rotting wood, broken furniture, and old ropes coiled like snakes in the corners. As I moved deeper, my flashlight caught something unusual. A small, leather-bound book lying on a table that looked ready to collapse. I picked it up carefully. The leather was cracked, the pages warped from years of moisture. It was a journal written by the old keeper. Most of the entries were mundane, tracking ships recording the weather. But then, toward the back, the tone changed. I hear them at night. Footsteps, always pacing on the stairs. But when I look, there's no one there. The light turns on by itself now. I can't seem to keep it off. Last night, I woke up outside. I don't remember leaving my bed. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. I put the journal back on the table and looked around the room, shining my flashlight into every corner. That's when I heard it. A faint creak, like someone stepping onto an old wooden board. I froze, listening, then another. This time it was louder, closer. The sound was coming from the staircase that wound up the tower. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and thin. No answer. I don't know why I didn't leave then and there. Maybe I thought it was just the wind or an animal that had found its way inside. Whatever it was, I started climbing. The staircase was narrow, the boards groaning under my weight. My flashlight flickers briefly and my stomach tightens. Halfway up, I heard the footsteps again, directly above me. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I reached the top, my heart pounding. The lantern room was empty. Rusted machinery sat idle in the center, and the glass panes were streaked with dirt and grime. But as I stepped inside, the room filled with a faint, flickering light. I spun around, but there was no source. The old lamp was still, its bulb shattered long ago. Yet the light grew brighter, pulsating in rhythm with the pounding in my chest. Then I felt it, a presence. Not something I could see or hear, but something that was undeniably there, watching me. The air grew heavier, pressing against me from all sides. The footsteps started again, but this time they were everywhere. Above me, below me, circling the room. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The light grew blinding, filling the room completely. I shut my eyes against it, but it burned through my eyelids, my ears filled with a deafening hum, drowning out the wind, the footsteps, everything. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the grass outside the lighthouse. The sky was lighter now, the first hints of dawn breaking through the clouds. My flashlight was gone, my phone dead. I sat up, trying to piece together what had happened. My head throbbed, and my clothes were damp from the dew. The lighthouse stood in the distance, silent and dark, just as it had been when I first saw it. But when I got back to my campsite, I noticed something strange. My boots were covered in salt, as though I'd been standing in the ocean. I haven't been able to explain what happened that night, and maybe I never will. All I know is that I'll never go back to that lighthouse again. The plan was simple, just me, my car, and the open road. I wasn't following any specific route, just driving wherever the roads took me. It was late afternoon when I saw the sign, an old faded wooden plank nailed to a post at the edge of the highway. Welcome to Dry Hollow. Something about it felt off. There were no other cars, no billboards, not even the faintest hint of traffic. The town wasn't marked on my GPS, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned off the main road and followed the cracked asphalt toward what looked like a forgotten piece of history. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your ears, making every sound you make feel intrusive. Dry Hollow wasn't much more than a handful of buildings scattered along a dirt road, storefronts with faded signs, a gas station with rusted pumps, and a small diner with its neon open sign flickering weakly in the window, but there was no one, not a single person. I parked my car in front of the diner, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires. As I stepped out, the air felt heavier, thicker somehow. The door to the diner was slightly ajar, so I pushed it open, the bell above it letting out a faint jingle. Inside, the place looked almost normal. Booths with cracked vinyl seats lined the walls, and a row of bar stools sat neatly in front of the counter. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air. On the counter sat a mug, steam still rising from it. Next to it, a half-eaten plate of eggs and toast. My stomach churned as I stared at the food. It wasn't rotten. It looked fresh. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. There was a notepad on the counter, the top page filled with writing. But as I picked it up, I realized the handwriting stopped mid-sentence, like whoever was writing it had been interrupted. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I heard the faint creak of a door swinging shut somewhere deeper in the diner. My first thought was that it was the wind, but then I felt it again. That heavy, watchful presence. I backed out of the diner quickly, nearly tripping over the threshold. The street outside looked the same as before, empty. But when I glanced back at my car, my breath caught. The driver's side door was open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. My keys were still in my pocket. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between two buildings. I spun around, but there was nothing there. That was enough for me. I got into the car, slamming the door shut, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of the parking lot, desperate to leave Dry Hollow behind. But as I drove, the road seemed wrong. The buildings that should have been fading in my rearview mirror were still there, lining the street like they were waiting for me. I turned left at the gas station, hoping to find my way back to the highway. Instead, I ended up back at the diner. I tried again, taking a different route this time. Right turn, then left, then another left. My heart pounded harder with every mile, but no matter which direction I drove, I always ended up in the same place. Parked in front of the diner, the neon sign still flickering. The shadows moved more freely now, darting across the street, slipping into doorways. I refused to get out of the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I don't know how many times I tried to leave. It felt like hours, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. My gas gauge ticked lower with every attempt, and panic clawed at me as I realized I might not make it out. At some point during the night, I stopped trying. Exhaustion took over, and I sat in the car, staring at the diner through the windshield. The shadows were closer now, hovering just at the edge of the headlights. Then, just as dawn began to break, everything shifted. The diner flickered like a static-filled TV, and the buildings around it seemed to shimmer. I blinked, and suddenly I was on the highway again, miles away from Dry Hollow. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, the rising sun finally burning off the weight of that terrible night. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the road behind me was empty. No sign of Dry Hollow. No sign it had ever existed. I wish I could say I imagined it. But sometimes when I park my car, I still hear the faint sound of that diner's bell, jingling softly in the back of my mind. And that wraps up our 4 dreadful middle-of-nowhere horror stories. Which one left you the most unsettled? Have you ever experienced something terrifying in the middle of nowhere? Share your story in the comments or send it to mrspookyhorror4b@gmail.com for a chance to be featured in a future video. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more horror content. Until next time, stay safe, and don't wander too far off the beaten path.